flow on, sweep away my pain, bring your healing to my heart, help me love once again. Cares and worries get me down, fear of failure fills my day. When I'm lost and all alone, help me, Lord, to find your way. People knocking at my door, strangers seeking love and care. Never let me turn them down. Teach me gently how to share. Children, come into my life with your laughter and your song. When will I become like them? Teach me, Lord, to sing along.
Dear friends, welcome back. Yesterday we were speaking about the rise of literacy in Israel at the time of King Solomon. And therefore, the stories about David, Saul and Samuel may have been recorded for the first time at the time of King Solomon, we can say. But with regard to the final author of the books of Samuel, we have to say that it is the Deuteronomistic author who edited the book, or who drafted the book, then edited it, and finally the final draft was prepared about 550 BC in the time of exile. That is what we can usually say about it. Therefore, the author, the final author, is the Deuteronomistic historian, and the date of composition is about 550. Okay, now with regard to the composition of the book, it is not that the authors or the author sat down and wrote one after another the historical incidents or events. On the other hand, the book would have been composed like this. There were different traditions that arose in the nation of Israel, and that too in different places. We know Prophet Samuel, he was living in his hometown called Ramah. Therefore, a tradition would have grown up about him in and around his hometown. Therefore, there would have been a history of Samuel or story of Samuel. Then we see, when Saul became the king, he was from Benjamin and ruling from Hebron. And there we see, there would have been a history that grew about him, a story narrated about him in his area. And when David became the king, and when Jerusalem was made the capital, the story about David was written down, or practically they were recorded at least, and they were transmitted orally and that would have been centered in Jerusalem. Thus we can see there were different traditions available at the time when the first historian of the book of Samuel began to write down the history. Thus, the Samuel tradition, Saul tradition, and David tradition, they formed the nucleus of the story or of the book of Samuel. And later on, once these traditions were compiled, other small traditions were added. The story of Prophet Nathan, the war narratives, the war between Philistines and Israel, about the narrative or the narrative about the Ark of Covenant or Ark of the Lord. All these would have been added later to this initial corpus, and thus we would have received the first draft of the book of Samuel. Therefore, the composition took place through different stages, and the authors, as we said earlier, probably not one individual, but a few authors or a school. That is what we can say about it. And the literary form used in the book of Samuel, we can say that different kinds of literary forms are used. Stories, fiction-like material, historical narrative or historical facts, references to customs and traditions, poetry and prose, everything is included in the story. Therefore, various literary forms are used in one and the same book, we can say. And with regard to the structure, usually it is said that the first part of the story is about Samuel, and up to chapter 8. But then we see the story of Samuel is going along with the story of Saul in the coming chapters too. But whatever it be, there's a tradition about Samuel, and this is usually said to be the cycle about Samuel or the tradition about Samuel. And then we have the Saul cycle or the tradition about King Saul, the first king. And that would go up to chapter 31 of the first Samuel or the last chapter of first Samuel. The entire history in the second Samuel deals with David. Therefore, we can say the three traditions are basic to the structure of Samuel, and it can be divided in this way. The detailed structure is clear when we look at the text, and it will be narrated in any commentary, and by going through the text itself we can see the detailed structure. And with regard to the purpose of writing this book, one of the important purpose, we can say, to narrate how kingship arose in Israel. And that is, Israel was a theocracy, God being the king over them and ruling over them. But now, in accordance with the demand of the people, we see that there is a growth in the expectation about the king. And Saul was rejected after his death, after his sin. And hence we can say there's a development of the story in the rise of kingship. In the beginning we see Saul was elected and he was guiding the people. But when he was rejected, we find the story of King David begins. And the authors have taken great care to explain the reason why Saul was rejected and how David was selected. Therefore, the important purpose is to narrate how the things proceeded or progressed in this way. And there were many questions remaining in the mind of the people which the authors have to give answer for. And it was for these purposes, we can say, the books of Samuel were written down. And mainly we can say to explain the transition from theocracy to kingship or monarchy. Therefore, this is what we are to speak about the books of Samuel in general. And now we enter into another important section. We are to remember certain points when we study the books of Samuel. Keep in mind these important points. Then only we can grasp the sense implied in the text and also understand properly the inner meaning conveyed through the story. One of the points is this, or the first point, let's say, the books of Samuel are really very good literature. And since we have read the books of Samuel, we know once we begin to read the book, probably we will not put it down until we finish reading the entire book. Samuel is such a fascinating book. We will be taken up by the narrative style and the storyline. And these all refer to the literary quality of the text contained in the book. And this is to be specially mentioned about a section of 2 Samuel. 2 Samuel chapters 9 to 20 is a text with the highest literary quality. And according to secular standards itself, it is extolled as one of the best pieces of literature. And this part usually we call it is the history of David's rise to the kingdom. And technically it is called the succession narrative. And why it is called a succession narrative? According to authors or commentators, this part, that is 2 Samuel chapters 9 to 20, would give an answer to the question, who would sit on the throne of David after his death to rule over Israel? The answer is given here. And that is the reason why we say it is a succession narrative. And according to many authors, the succession narrative is not concluded in 2 Samuel. 2 Samuel chapter 20 is followed by 1 Kings chapters 1 and 2. And therefore we can say the two chapters or in 1 Kings also go together with this. For this is the way how things proceed. And with regard to this is what is to be said with regard to the literary quality of the text. Okay. A second point that we are to remember is the book of Samuel is composed of different cycles or different traditions. We already mentioned about three important traditions: Samuel tradition, Saul tradition, and David tradition. And besides these important traditions, other instances also or small traditions will be added at the time or later, and thus we get the draft of a book, we can say. Therefore, we have to remember that the books of Samuel are written by combining together various traditions, and mainly three. And the third point we are to remember is this: when different traditions are put together by an author, there can be some problems which are to be addressed in a satisfactory way. And what are the problems arising here? When two or three traditions are put together, there can be the problem of repetition. That is, the same story may be repeated in different ways in two traditions. Therefore, the problem of repetition. And another would be the problem of contradiction. We know that when different traditions are put together, it can happen what is said in one tradition may be contradicted in another tradition. Therefore, the compiler of the story should take very special care to avoid all kinds of contradictions. And a third problem that will usually arise is the problem of discontinuity in the course of the narrative or in the flow of the narrative, we can say. Because when traditions are compiled together, sometimes there may be a kind of overlapping and causing repetition, and also there could be the problem of discontinuity. The story said in one may not be followed by another story in another tradition, giving a proper connection or link. They may stand out as separate stories without a proper continuity. For these problems could be there or always are there in the story. Okay, we will take one example for this. We all are familiar with the story of King Saul and his encounter with David for the first time. Okay, when did King Saul meet David for the first time? Okay, if we read through the text, we find in chapter 16, there a story is narrated, and here we read in verse 14, the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him. And then it is said, let our Lord now command the servants who attend you to look for someone who is skillful in playing the lyre. Therefore, we can say like this, Saul was affected with the depression, and music therapy is suggested, and they sought out a boy who can sing well and play the instruments. And this we see is being fulfilled in verse 18. One of the young men answered, I have seen a son of Jesse the Bethlehemite, who is skillful in playing, a man of valor, a warrior, prudent in speech, and a man of good presence, and the Lord is with him. Okay, therefore we see David is introduced here as a boy who is good in singing and also who is a good warrior. And now we see David enters the service of King Saul. In verse 21, David came to Saul and entered his service. Saul loved him greatly, and he became his armor bearer. Okay, now what is the meaning of armor bearer? We know in early times they were not carrying all the weapons on their back. The soldiers cannot do that. There could be the possible danger, and that is the danger of a sword being broken, the spear again may be broken, the shield may be split, or the arrows may be exhausted, and there is a limit that the soldier can take with him, extra weapons. And if the extra weapons are not available, it will be a great danger for the person, because the enemy may attack him when he is deprived of proper weapons, we are sure. And how this problem was solved in the early years. And we can say that there would be a person who is called armor bearer, who would be carrying extra swords or spears, shield, bows and arrows. The supplementary items are carried by him, and he should be readily available for the soldier. He is not to keep away. Therefore, in the face of the war, he should be closely following the warrior or the fighter at his heel, we can say, so that he would be functioning just like a bodyguard too. When, let us say, the hero is fighting with the enemy in the front, it is possible that in a war somebody may come from behind to attack. and to take him by surprise. But the armor bearer has to see whether somebody is coming to attack from the rear. And therefore, he is not merely an armor bearer, but he is also fulfilling the role of a bodyguard, we can say. And such a person is called armor bearer. And this armor bearer has a very important position, especially in his dealings with the great hero, because he always moves with him and always takes guard of him. All these things are there, and therefore he will be one of the best known soldier, or one who is so closely associated with the warrior, we can say. And here in the story we read that David became the armor bearer of King Saul. What does it imply? It was a very good close relationship that existed between King Saul and David. And further we read, always David was raised to the status of the chief of the army even. That happens later. But we see here, being the armor bearer, there was always a close association with the person. And now we look at chapter 17, where we read the story of the duel, the fight between the giant Goliath, the Philistine, and David, the Israelite. We know David was a young man, and practically he was not very tall. Usually it is said to be he was around 5 feet and 5 feet 2 inches high, therefore rather short in figure. But the giant, he was almost more than 8.5 feet tall. And here we find as the story moves on, we find the Israelite army is hiding or is not ready to encounter the giant Goliath. And for 40 days he came out of the camp of Philistines morning and evening and challenged Israel to come and fight with him. Therefore, Israel can choose anyone to fight with the giant, but no one was ready to come forward. And as we know the story, we know David, who came from home to provide food for his brothers who were serving in the military, he happened to see all this scenario, and he became indignant towards this Philistine because he was blaspheming the God of Israel. And okay, we will see that story at a later time too. And later on we know the end of the story. David is killing him, or he is able to kill the giant. And when he was proceeding to fight with the giant, Saul asked his military chief Abner, "Who is this young man?" When the duel was over, when David becomes victorious, we find David asked the military chief Abner in verse 55, 1 Samuel 17:55. Abner, whose son is this young man? Abner said, as your soul lives, O king, I do not know. The king said, inquire whose son is the stripling is. On David's return from killing the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul. And Saul said to him, whose son are you, young man? David answered, I am the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite. When Saul asked Abner, whose son is this? Abner actually did not know. But later on it was revealed that David was the son of Jesse. And now the question is, if David was already in the service of the king, he should have known him. Then how can this contradiction be there? And we can say like this, both stories come from both the traditions or different traditions. And chapter 16 is from Saul tradition and chapter 17 from David tradition. And therefore, the hero of the story will be extolled even at the expense of others. And hence, in chapter 17 we find David is extolled. And it is because of this the difference in the story evolves or it remains. And we have to find out a satisfactory answer for this that we will do tomorrow. Okay, thank you and God bless you.
Loving God, we thank you for the blessing of reading your word together. We ask that these words of life, truth, and hope would continue to impact us in the days ahead. May your love and grace follow each of us, refreshed and blessed by you. Amen.